I'm going to spend most of the day or this evening with you and talk about an alternative economic model, because I think I don't need to spend a great deal of time telling you that the system is in trouble. I assume you've figured that out. I am deeply grateful for having been invited, but the project on rethinking prosperity is a little bit like a project about thinking about something that isn't there. We don't have prosperity. That is, we have an economic system that is now delivering prosperity to a shrinking proportion of the population that wasn't large to start with. I'm not going to reiterate the statistics of inequality. I assume you know what they are. They are grim. I live in Manhattan, and we just passed a milestone. The average price of a one-bedroom apartment in New York crossed $1 million. The average price of a one-bedroom apartment in Manhattan, that includes the Bronx, which is a poverty-stricken area, so it's an average. You can imagine what things cost in the quote-unquote nice parts of town. New York is a playground for very wealthy people, increasingly. Even parts of the city that once were poor or working class are being rapidly gentrified. But then again, my understanding is you know that real well from your own city, and we have it even more. So this is a country that's having extraordinary difficulties, and I want to argue that they have to do with a system, and then present to you, if I can, an alternative way that we could go and that I believe we should go. So let's begin by a number of indices of a system that doesn't work. First and simplest, we have, depending on how you count, somewhere between 10 and 15 million unemployed people in the United States. People looking for work who can't find it. Many of them have been looking for a year or two. Just keep the number in mind, 10 to 15 million who are looking for work. The Federal Reserve, our central bank, keeps a statistic, very important if you're not familiar with it, called the rate of capacity utilization. It's really a fancy term for a measure of what portion of the tools, equipment, fleets of trucks, office space, factory space, what portion of it is being used for production, and what portion of it is just sitting there, gathering rust and dust. And the current statistic right now is about 20% of our means of production are just sitting there, literally disintegrating. Okay, let's see. 10 to 15 million people who want to work. They're looking for work all the time. They have to get whatever benefits they may be entitled to. All the tools and equipment and raw materials they could possibly want to work with and to work on, sitting there, going to waste. You put the two together and we're talking between $1 and $2 trillion worth of output. Output we are capable of, but not producing. We have cities that are literally falling apart. I'm going to mention them in a little detail in a minute. We have a population that's aging, that needs attention and needs facilities that this kind of production could attend to. We have a mass of people with children who cannot navigate the problem of both parents working because there's no sustaining basis for taking care of their children in a reasonable way. You could all make a list in 10 minutes of the things that need to be done in this society that are not being done, even though we have the people who would like to do them and all the tools and equipment they could possibly want. An economic system that can be described the way I just did has lost its right to exist. It's a failure. I know that may be difficult, I know it may be painful to hear, but if you're not willfully self-blinded, you've got to see what's going on. Over the last 30 years, the employing class, particularly the large employers, have made a decision. The decision is a rewriting of American history. Through most of our history, from the time that Europeans first came over here and eliminated the local population, the country proved to be very fertile. The rivers, very nice. Coastline, very convenient. You could make a lot of money producing. You had everything you needed with one exception. You didn't have any people to work. And the problem was solved by bringing people from Europe here so that you would solve your labor shortage, which is what we call it in economics. In the southern part of the United States, we solved the problem by slavery from Africa. In the rest of the United States, we solved the problem through the 18th and 19th and into the 20th century by one wave of immigrants after another, where many of you come from. Polish, Irish, Italian, you know. We're a country like that because that's how we were organized economically. And because the labor shortage was such a continuing problem, the employer class solved it, not in the case of the slaves, but in the case of the non-slaves, by creating the incentive for people to come here. And to make a long story short, that incentive was rising wages that would show people from Europe that despite the fear of crossing the ocean and leaving your home and going to a new place, the promise of a better life here outweighed all the negatives, and you made the scary trip. And when you got here, it turned out it was kind of right. And you let your family back home know, and that only made the next wave come a little easier. Capitalism was very successful here. Could find jobs, could pay the high wages. Eventually, the working class in this country got its act together, as they always do, and formed the trade unions and the socialist and other parties and began to fight for higher wages, even higher than they might have otherwise gone. And so between the time we become a country and the 1970s, wages rise, partly because we have this labor shortage problem, and partly because we have a working class that fights. By 1970, this story, which is similar to the story of Europe and similar for a shorter time in the story of Japan, we have capitalism in a peculiar way. It's only 200 or 300 years old, this capitalism that now dominates the world. And in the 200 or 300 years, it was concentrated in actually a small part of the earth, Western Europe, North America, and Japan. It has since spread all over the world, but it was always concentrated there. That's where most of the factories were built. That's where most of the stores exist. That's where most of the offices were built. In other words, capitalism concentrated its facilities, and therefore the jobs, in the places of its origin. Western Europe, North America, and Japan. And that's where the wages rose. And what was the role of the rest of the world? We use in economics the term hinterland. The hinterland at first was whatever was beyond the boundary of the factory town, the rural areas nearby. They were to provide inputs to capitalism, raw materials for the people to work on in the cities, food for the people to eat in the cities, and a flow of labor off the countryside to work in the cities. And after a while, one more thing, to buy part of the output of the factories in the cities. But the hinterland, in this dependent role, didn't experience rising wages. Not only didn't have labor shortage, it had not enough things for the workers to do. Wages in the hinterland, where the majority of people were, didn't rise. They stayed where they were or they fell. By 1970 then, the gap between the wages and standard of living of Europeans, North Americans, and Japanese on the one hand, and the rest of the world on the other, was extreme. And then capitalism did what capitalism always does. We call something the profit motive because it's a nice summary of what drives the system. Capitalists, you might say, had a eureka moment in the 1970s. It was the time when the jet engine came into play. You could get to any corner of the world in a matter of hours. It was also the time when modern telecommunications comes into play, and you can now supervise workers in an office or a factory 10,000 miles away instantaneously. And the eureka moment of businesses were this: we have a great idea, the first businesses said. Why don't we leave North America, Western Europe, and Japan, where the wages have risen for 150 years, and go someplace else? Oh, I know where, to the hinterland, where people are desperate and poor and will work for next to nothing. And the first ones went. And it was hard and difficult. You had to go overcome some obstacles, but they made profits like they had never fantasized. They could produce all the goods that North America, Western Europe, and Japan could dream of, but they could pay wages a tiny fraction. 3 months ago, there was a demonstration of about 200,000 people walking down the main street of Dhaka in Bangladesh. They were marching for a minimum wage of $100 per hour. Excuse me, $100 per month. Because it's currently $38 per month of a 40-hour week. That's why the companies are leaving. There's no mystery here. Company after company leaves. That's why all of you are wearing clothes tonight that say, you know what they say, made in Japan, made in Bangladesh, made in fill in the blank. That's how you toasted your bread for breakfast. Much of what's in your car is already made there, and on and on and on. Now let's look at that for a minute. Why is it done? Because it's profitable. The profit motive. You leave the United States. Let me make sure you understand where I'm going. Starting in the 1970s, capitalism abandoned the United States. I need to let that just sit for a minute. It left. Now let's look at what it means. First, the clothing you're wearing, which used to come from a place a few miles away, is now dragged across 10,000 miles by a ship that pollutes the water, pollutes the air, under conditions that cause every disease we know of to the people who live in the unsanitary conditions, if they're lucky enough to escape death by fire or other outrageous afflictions. You want to know what causes the pollution of the ocean? It is the profit motive that leads capitalists to produce something far away and ship it back here, because the cost of shipping is less than what is saved on the wages you pay. That's why your shirt was made in China. What are the other consequences? The other consequences are the abandonment of the United States. I'm going to take one example, but there could be hundreds. The example I take, because I find it so dramatic, is Detroit. In 1970, Detroit had a population of almost 2 million people. It was the most successful capitalist city in the country. Presidents would bring visitors from foreign countries and have a big celebration in Detroit. Detroit had a working class with a good set of incomes. They all had good jobs in the Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler companies. African Americans who had not been given a chance to have decent jobs in the country since the beginning could go to Detroit and get a job in the auto factory and get a reasonable salary and live a reasonable life. And so excited was the African American community, able to do this in Detroit like nowhere else, that they produced a whole new music, the Motown sound, that changed music in the whole world. It was a culturally vibrant place. It was integration that worked. It was, wow, 2 million people, capitalist success. And then in the 1970s, it begins. 3 groups of 15 people, the board of directors of General Motors, the board of directors of Ford, and the board of directors of Chrysler, decide they can make more money by moving the production of automobiles somewhere else. First to other parts of the United States, then to Canada and Mexico, and now to Latin America and Asia. So they leave. Fast forward to 2015. The population of Detroit today is 700,000 people. The majority of the people of Detroit were driven out of the city in the last 30 years, ripped away from their families, their jobs, their churches, their kin systems, their friendships, everything. 1/3 of the houses in Detroit are empty. It's a disaster, replicated in Cleveland, in Camden, New Jersey. The town I was born in, Youngstown, Ohio, is one after the other. Over the years during which capitalism made those cities big and prosperous, the employer asked for many things from the community: tax breaks, subsidies, special courses taught in schools that would prepare young people to take jobs in their factories, roads built over here, not over there, to facilitate the billions were provided to them. But when they decided to leave, private enterprise can make any decision it wants when it wants to. Were they required to pay back all that was given to them to help them grow and be successful? No. They got up and left because it was more profitable to go someplace else. And the social, emotional, personal, financial disaster they left behind is none of their concern. That's how the system works. Do they pollute the oceans to bring that stuff back to us? You bet. The same executive who made that decision contributes each year to Earth Day. Why not? If you don't change the system, you don't solve the problem. Lesson again, a different way. 75 years ago in the 1930s, we had a collapse of capitalism. It's called the Great Depression. It starts in 1929, it lasts till 1941. It's a disaster. 1933, the unemployment in the United States, 25%, 5 times roughly what it is today. So catastrophic was that depression that President Roosevelt and most other politicians went to work passing laws and regulations and reforms, which they promised would do 2 things: get us out of this terrible depression and make sure we never have another one again. Every president since Roosevelt has made exactly the same promise. Every president since Roosevelt had to make the promise because every president since Roosevelt presided over an economic downturn and thereby came up with plans and proposals and that are going to do two things: get us out of this terrible depression and make sure it never happens again. Every president promised it. No president delivered it. Everything has been tried by this capitalist system to overcome its instability, its bizarre, dysfunctional, massively wasteful tendency every 3 to 7 years to suddenly throw millions of people out of work, shut down countless businesses, leave people unemployed, leave the tools and equipment unused the way I just described it, so that we all lose out on the output we need for all kinds of social issues. You think we only had a collapse in the 30s and another one in 2008? Something called the National Bureau of Economic Research is the agency that keeps track of economic cycles. Between the end of the Great Depression, 1941, and the beginning of the current one, 2008, we had 11 other economic downturns, including a couple of doozies like in 1974. I like to summarize it this way. If you lived with a roommate as unstable as capitalism, you would have moved out long ago. Or you would have demanded that your roommate get some professional help. But you live with an economic system whose instabilities are staggeringly damaging, and yet many of you seem unable to draw the inference that maybe there's a problem here that needs to be addressed. The rules, the regulations, and the reforms haven't worked. They haven't stopped the cycles. They haven't stopped the waste. We're in another one now. Smart people have worked at this. One of the greatest was a British economist named John Maynard Keynes, who came up with a whole economic theory and things called fiscal and monetary policies that governments could pursue that would make these downturns less horrible, that would make them less frequent. None of it works. And if none of it works, then we got a system with a problem, a big problem. Last year, a famous French economist named Thomas Piketty published a book called Capital in the 21st Century. He, together with his frequent co-author, Emmanuel Saez, who's a professor of economics at UC Berkeley, are the world's greatest authorities on the distribution of wealth and income. Any of you are interested, just look up Piketty and Saez on the internet. They maintain a fantastic website, freely available, where all of their data are constantly updated and available for you to use. So Mr. Piketty summarized 25 years of this research in that book. It's a 600-page book. He's not the world's greatest writer, so if you get it, it's a bit of a slog. Plus he's French and the translation wasn't the greatest either. But here's his message. Wherever capitalism has become the dominant system, England, Europe, North America, Japan, anywhere else, one tendency is unmistakable. The tendency to produce ever widening inequality of wealth and income. He documents it for the 18th century, the 19th century, the 20th century, and now. Relentlessly, across countries. It's very impressive. Periodically, people can't stand it anymore, and they rise up and they stop the deepening inequality, reverse it for a while, but then, as the relentless structure of the system kicks in, it resumes. In the 1930s, we here in the United States rose up as a nation. We did. And part of it was the outrage between the wealth of the few and the massive suffering of the many. So in the 1930s, a movement developed from below in America, as it did elsewhere, demanding that something be done, that a few were rich and the masses were suffering the unemployment that they suffered. A movement comprising the largest labor organizing drive in the history of this country, called the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, put millions of people in labor unions. We've never seen anything like that before. We've never seen anything like it since. Working with the labor unions, with two socialist parties and the American Communist Party. I know that may come as a troubling thing for some of you to know that you had a strong socialist and communist party, and I do not mean to upset you, but if you didn't already know it, your problem isn't with me, it's with whoever taught you American history. The socialists and the communists worked with the unions, and they went to Mr. Roosevelt after they had mobilized 10 million people, and they said to him, Mr. Roosevelt, you are our president, we like you. But you've got to do something for everybody. You've got to do something to offset the inequality of income and wealth. We will not tolerate it. And if you don't, we won't vote for you anymore, and you won't be the president. And then the socialists and the communists, part of it piped up and said, you know what else? If you don't do something, there'll be a revolution here like there was in Russia. Think about it, Mr. President. It was not a pleasant conversation. But the president was a smart politician. So he went to the rich and the corporate leaders. That was easy for him to do. He was one. And he said to them, I just had a troubling meeting. He summarized what I just told you. He looked at them and he said, you know, we got a real problem here. These people are not happy. They want something. And I think we better give it to them. But we got a problem, ladies and gentlemen, he said. Well, I take that back. No ladies. Not then. It was early. They hadn't figured that part out yet. So gentlemen, he said, we got a problem. Because you see, with millions of unemployed, they don't have an income. And if they don't have an income, they don't pay taxes. So the government has no money. That should be familiar to you. It's like what governments say now. There's not enough money. We can't do this. We can't do that. There's not enough money. Well, if you have 5 times greater unemployment, you got 5 times less money. So Mr. Roosevelt said, I have to do something for these people, otherwise I won't be president. I have to do something for these people, otherwise there might be a revolution. But the government has no money to do this for the people. So, said the president, looking them right in the eye, the only solution is to do what the mass of people want, looking them right in the eye, and taking your money to do it. Because you're the only people who have any. Wow. Those corporate leaders and those rich people, they did not like this message. Half of them developed in an instant a hatred for Mr. Roosevelt that they still have. Their descendants are called names like the Koch brothers. The other half were scared. Mr. Roosevelt won them over by saying, I think you should give me all the money I need, because if you don't, there'll be a revolution and you won't have any money to give anybody. They were scared. So they said, yeah, we'll do it. That's all Mr. Roosevelt needed. He's a good politician. He went back to the unions and the communists and he said, okay, here's the deal. I will change the distribution of wealth and income. I'm going to take from the rich and give to the poor. It's what you want, isn't it? I'll give you that. But you got to stop all this talk about revolution. No more of that. Shut up about that. Otherwise, there's no deal. We're going to leave the capitalists in charge of the business. But we're going to redistribute wealth and income because that's what you want, isn't it? And the unions and the socialists and the communists basically said, okay, we'll go. We'll buy it. And so Mr. Roosevelt delivered, because he was an honest politician. He delivered. He taxed corporations and the rich. Because this is America, and because I know you and I'm an American just like you, I'm going to say that again. He taxed corporations and the rich big time and used the money for the mass of people to ameliorate their problems. Number one, he goes on the radio, because there was no TV yet, and he says, I'm going to create the Social Security system. We didn't have such a thing in America. I'm going to give every person 65 years of age or older a check every month for the rest of their lives. Why? Because I want to. And he did. And he used rich people's money to do that. And when that was done, he stood up and said, I got another great idea. It's called unemployment compensation. You lose your job, which of course millions of workers had just done, and I'm going to give you a check every week, for half a year, year and a half, to tide you over. And he used the money of rich people to do that. Then he passed the first minimum wage. We never had that before, so that people couldn't be paid so little that having a job or not made almost no difference. But I left the biggest and the best for the end. He got on the radio and he said, if the private sector of our capitalist economy is either unable or unwilling to provide jobs for the millions of Americans who ask for nothing other than a job, then it's my job as president to do it. Between 1934 and 41, the federal government created and filled 15 million jobs. And how did the government pay those 15 million American families who now didn't have to lose their house, who didn't have to feel awful about themselves, who didn't have to kick the dog in their upset and rage, or their wife or children either? He took it from rich people. The president ripped off the rich to help everybody else. How did he do it? No mystery, nothing is complicated. This is so easy, it could be done tomorrow. Not only that, Mr. Obama, like Mr. Bush, know exactly this story. 1944, the federal government raised its money by taxing the income of individuals and the income of corporations. It's exactly how the government gets most of its money now, the federal government. In 1944, just to use one example, for every dollar the federal government got for taxing individuals, it got $1.50 from taxing the profits of corporations. Corporations together paid 50% more into the government than individuals. What's the relationship today? For every dollar that the federal government raises from individuals, today it raises from corporations 25 cents. Do you understand? The last 50 years have shifted the burden of taxation off of corporations onto individuals. But we're not done. What was the highest tax rate that the president proposed for rich people? You're gonna like this. In 1944, the State of the Union message delivered by Roosevelt to the Congress. He proposed that the top tax bracket on the richest people be 100%. Let me do that again. His proposal was, if you earned more than $25,000 a year, every dollar over $25,000, the federal government tax rate on that would be 100%. In other words, if you earned over $25,000, you wouldn't earn over $25,000. You wouldn't get any of it. $25,000 today, about $380,000. Wow. The president wanted to tax rich people big time. He sent a message to Congress and the Republicans went ballistic. They were already good at that then. And they had the usual yelling back and forth, and a compromise was reached. And here was the compromise. 94% agreed to by Republicans and Democrats and signed by the president. Every dollar over $25,000 you earned, and you got to keep 6 cents, and you gave the government 95. Do you understand? So when someone says you can't tax the rich, are you kidding? We've been there, we've done that. This is not a hypothetical. This is a done deal. The only thing that's interesting about what I just told you, and I won't embarrass you, don't worry, is how many of you didn't know that. That's amazing. We've just been through a debate in this country what to do about our terrible economic downturn. And how many debates did you hear about how big a federal employment program we should have? You didn't hear anything because we've had a collective amnesia contributed to by both Republicans and Democrats that the issue isn't even in the paper. It isn't debated at all. It's not there. Many of you probably think that a politician can't tax the rich to help everybody else. It would be committing political suicide. Really? The one president in our history who actually did it, Roosevelt, was elected 4 times. He's the most popular president we ever had. Nobody's even close. Are you kidding? You want to become popular fast. Tax the rich and give it to everybody else. Robin Hood pays. But you can't have that in a country. So it's important that what I just told you about your country's history is hot news for you. So much so that there will be some of you that are going to check your history book tonight just to see if I made this all up. I assure you I didn't. But we live in a system that immediately Mr. Roosevelt was dead, everything that was accomplished then by the pressure of those people from below was destroyed. No sooner was the man in his grave than the Republicans pushed through a law which makes it impossible for any president to have more than 2 terms. They didn't want this to happen again. And then they went to work to undo everything that had been done. And they succeeded. And that success is crucial for you to understand. They succeeded in undoing it. Why? Because the New Deal had left in the hands of the corporations the power, the wealth. The same people still sat at the top of these corporations, gathering the profits in which they then used to buy the political support, to convince the mass of people to turn it all around so that capitalism could resume its normal functioning, producing the inequality that we all bemoan today. Wow. And how did they do it? By destroying the coalition that had forced the New Deal in the first place, that had forced Roosevelt to do the things I've just described to you. What was the coalition again? Unions, socialists, communists. And when you destroy a coalition, the way you do it always is you try to find the weak link first and go after it. The weak link in 1946 was the Communist Party. And what they did to them, very simple. Instead of them being understood to be the militants who had mobilized everybody into the labor unions, which is what they had done, they were what we would now call rebranded. They weren't militants who had led the struggle, blah, 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 that led to the Social Security system and unemployment and minimum wages and federal jobs, things that most people really liked. No, no, no. They were the evil agents of a foreign power. They were commies dictated by Russia. You need comic book mentality to appreciate this, because that's the level at which this was pitched. But it worked. You arrested the leaders, the Smith Act, some of you remember your history. You deported people. You terrorized the American people about the communists. You destroyed that part. And when you were done, you went and did the same thing to the socialists. And you know how you did it? You went around the United States, private and public agencies, and you said to the American people, you know those socialists? They're just like the communists. They just spell it differently. It's the same thing. This is very important. My background, my family is European. If you go to any European country, people know the difference between socialism and communism. There's not a problem. Everybody understands there's a Socialist Party, Communist Party, and so on. When I started teaching here in the United States, my students, I realized they think that socialist, communist, Marxist, terrorist, and anarchist are synonyms. They think it's the same. At first I thought, what's the matter with them? Are they dumb? Are they stupid? No, 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 no. Americans are no less capable mentally than anybody else. What had happened was this destruction of the coalition that had hammered home that it's all the same. You all know that there are large parts of the United States today that say that communist, socialist, anarchist, terrorist, Marxist, and liberal are the same word. There are large parts of the United States. My son-in-law was born and raised in Mississippi. I went to his Thanksgiving celebration in Tupelo, Mississippi, and I talked to the 75 members of the family gathered there, and I can tell you there's a lot of people who think that those are all synonyms. That's why when this crisis hit, even though it's a terrible crisis, even though millions of people are unemployed, even though that we have the history I just told you, nothing like it has happened. No welling up of people joining the unions, nothing like it. No welling up of socialists or communists, nothing like it. Wow. Why? Because the American people were taught, don't get involved in any group that's looking to change society. It's going to get you in a peck of trouble. Stay away. Very hard to organize things in this country because a real good job was done. That's our history. That's why we have an economic system that is not working, broken, producing everything from the pollution of the ocean to grotesque inequality to the waste of resources, everything I've told you. And yet we don't seem able to take the rational step. It's as if we were all the proverbial deer caught in the headlights. We don't know what to do. We don't like it. Even when we flare up with a moment, Occupy Wall Street, it seems not to stay. And yet, and I'm going to conclude with this, there are alternatives. And I want to throw one at you with some detail, and I can. And it's a good thing there are, because the consciousness in America is shifting and fast. 10 days ago, there was an event that is historic in the context of what I just told you. Bernard Sanders and Hillary Clinton had a debate. I know there were several other people on the stage, but I've forgotten their names, and so have they. So there were those two. And what was really interesting to me was the way our history that I've just described to you was finally overcome that night. First, a man with the label socialist is actually up there, and he's running for president, and it seems to be okay. He had no visible horns. When he spoke, no fire came from his mouth. And he was able to articulate. He looked like a kindly older fellow with kind of messy white hair, and he's a senator. How dangerous can he be? A socialist, right up there. That broke a 50-year taboo. But even more important was something said by Hillary Clinton in that debate. There was a moment when she turned and looked into the camera. She's very well coached. She looked into the camera and she said, remember, sometimes you have to save capitalism from itself. That's what she said. A leading candidate for president is defensive about capitalism. Hallelujah. Finally. She may not have understood what she was admitting, but I think the American people got it. Oh boy, but good. You've got to defend it now. I don't know quite what it means to defend capitalism from itself, but it's a sign that something needs defending. We're a nation that has been afraid to debate capitalism for 50 years. Part of the repression of the socialists and communists was you couldn't do that. Our political representatives outdo one another in cheerleading for capitalism. We may debate what the school system should be like. We may debate what the education system, the energy system. We even debate what marriage is. But debate capitalism? That's the holy of holies. And you know what happens to a society that has a system as part of it that it can't discuss, it can't criticize, it can't debate? That thing rots. Because the only way you keep something healthy is to look at what's wrong and fix it. If you don't look at what's wrong with capitalism, you don't fix it. And when you don't fix it, you got what we've got. A dysfunctional economy that's polluting and unequal and wasteful. And you can stand up and down and celebrate abstractly this and that about it, but there's no getting around what I've told you. I didn't make it up. So what is the alternative? It's not passing some rules and regulations and reforms. We've been there, we've done that. Out of the Great Depression, there was every reform imaginable. Did it prevent the next downturn? No. Were they able to endure these reforms? No. We're going to do this all again? No. You're not going to get the American people to do it again. They have learned that isn't a solution. Well, what might be? The solution is to learn from what happened last time. The New Deal was a perfectly fine idea, but it was undone because nobody ever took the next step to change the decision-making, the organization of enterprises. You left the capitalists in charge of the industry. And of course, for them, they then used their power and the profits they gathered in their hands to undo what had been done to them. That's why the taxes are back down on business and the taxes are back down on individuals, particularly rich ones, etc. So the lesson is you've got to change the organization of business. You've got to change the way we organize the offices, the factories, and the stores. And I'll tell you exactly how we do this. By the way, I'm telling you not as a good idea for the future, but as a good idea learning from our past, and the model I'm going to present to you is already in existence in many parts of the world. We're going to democratize the enterprise. What does that mean? We're not going to allow a continuation of a tiny number of people to own and operate our industries. Most of the work in this country is done by an institution called a corporation. Here's how it works, for those of you who are not familiar. Every year, there's an election, every year in a corporation. All the shareholders vote every year on who's going to be the board of directors. The board of directors in every company decides what it produces, what technology it uses, where it undertakes the production, and what's done with the profits. The big four decisions that every enterprise has to make. The board of directors, typically 15, 20 people, that's what it is, whether the company employs 1,000 or 100,000 or anything else. So let's get clear. A tiny number of people, 15, the board of directors, makes the decision. 15 members of the board of directors, General Motors, decided to leave Detroit with the disaster I described. How do you get to be on the board of directors? You're elected every year. How does it work? You get one vote for every share you own. If you own a share of General Motors, you get one vote. If you own 100 shares of General Motors, you get 100 votes. You own no shares of General Motors, that's how many votes you get. Not one person, one vote, one share, one vote. Now here's a statistic you don't ever want to forget. 1% of shareholders in the United States own 75% of the shares. Let me do that again. 1% of the shareholders own 75% of the shares. That's the 1% that decides who runs the corporations of America. They pick the people, they put them there, and they move them when they don't want them. And those people decided to move out of Detroit and decimate the city. They decided to make your socks in China so they could pollute the ocean by bringing them back here, etc., etc. And guess what, friends? If you allow the profits of what we all produce in the corporations we all work for to be decided in terms of what happens to them by the tiny group of people at the top elected by the 1%, can you really be surprised if it turns out that what they do with those profits is hand them out as dividends on shares and big pay packages to the top officials? It's the people giving the money to themselves. I dare say some of you in this room, if you were in their position, would do that too. And if you don't want the system to work like that, they shouldn't be in the position of making those decisions, should they? You know, at the Christmas party in a corporation, the CEO usually at a certain point stands up on a chair in the party. He's a little wobbly because he's drunk too much. And slurring his speech, he says to the gathered workers, I want to thank you all, because every one of you in the room did his and her part to produce the profits. Not realizing that this silly drunken speech is actually very interesting, because if everybody played a role, then here's a little democratic question for you. How come everybody isn't playing a role, deciding what to do with it? How come you drunken fellow, why is it you and your 3 friends are doing this? Here's a thought that really should come as a bombshell. Suppose we bring democracy to the workplace. Suppose we say, this is a real new idea, that if you are affected by a decision at the workplace, you have a right to participate in making it. You know, the kind of idea we have everywhere else in our communities, in our residences, in our towns. We say the mayor, the governor, the senator can make decisions that affect us, but we have some power over them. We vote for them, we vote against them, and so on. We have some power over the people who have power over us. Why don't we do that in the workplace? Why don't we say that in the workplace, everybody who works there has a vote, an equal vote, since they all live with the consequences? Wow, democratize the enterprise. Why might this be a good idea? And here we'll conclude with this. First, the workplace is where adults spend most of their lives. 5 out of 7 days, the best hours of the day, you're at work. If you believe in democracy, it's the first place it should have been instituted. And in the history of the United States, it was never instituted there. Are we fighting a war in Afghanistan and Iraq to bring them a democracy we don't have? Where's the democracy in the workplace? When you go into your workplace, when you close the door, you're not just leaving outside, you're leaving whatever democracy there is, because inside that workplace, you are told what to do, how to do, where to do it, when to do it. And when you're done, you go home and you leave behind what you produced. And if you forget that rule and take some of it home, people in dark blue uniforms come to your house and they hurt you to help you remember, don't they? Wow. Now let's suppose the workplaces of America were run by the workers in them, democratically. We actually were democratic in the workplace. Let's explore briefly as conclusion what that might mean. Let's start with the following. Shall we leave the United States and move the production to China? Private capitalist? Sure, we can pay low wages. Collective of workers? Are you crazy? Do away with our own jobs? That's dead on arrival. We're not going anywhere. Oh, you mean if we had a democratic decision of where production is going to occur, we wouldn't see the exodus of our jobs? Yeah, we wouldn't. Just think. They wouldn't be able to go. Wow. Here's another one. A new technology will allow us to make more profits, but it really pollutes the air. The capitalists say, yeah, but we want more profits. And about the air, we live in a gated community with a big fan. What do we care? The mass of workers now in a democratic city, they have to make a decision. Sure, on the one hand, they want higher profits, but on the other hand, they don't want to breathe that air. It's them, it's their families, it's their children. They're going to decide in a completely different pattern and way about those questions than is decided now, because they're not governed by the profit motive alone. They weigh other dimensions because they live with them. All of them do. Here's another example. How do you divide the profits a company makes? Do you give a few people stunning amounts of money while everybody else has to borrow to send their kids to school? Never gonna happen. If the distribution of profits were democratically controlled, they would distribute them much less unequally than they now do. You want to do something about inequality? Change the system. Otherwise, you aren't serious. We've tried everything else. Tax rules, sharing rules. They don't work. And when they do, they're undone in the twinkle of a historical eye. Wow. Bring democracy to the workplace, be true to the American commitment to democracy, and you would have a completely different economy, and it would have a completely different economic history of this country. And why not? This is not a new idea. Whether this is called a worker co-op, or a worker self-directed enterprise, or a dozen other names that it has had. It is very old. Some of you know of a religious community in America known as the Shakers, produce beautiful furniture. That's how they organize production, in a worker co-op. Go to Hancock, New York, there's Shaker Village there, take a trip, they'll show you. In the Bay Area, there are 5 bakeries called Arizmendi Bakery. They're worker co-ops. There used to be 1, but it's so successful, there are now 5. That's how they work. You don't have to imagine it. But I'm going to end by telling you the story of the most successful of these to give you an idea of what's possible. In 1956, in a dirt poor part of a country in Europe, Spain, in the foothills of the Pyrenees Mountains, on the Spanish side, the Pyrenees separate France from Spain. On the Spanish side is a small city called Mondragon. Mondragon. There was a priest there by the name of Father Arizmendi. Yeah, the same name as the bakeries in the Bay Area. Catholic priest. This is a part of Spain that's called the Basque country. It's a special group of people with their own culture and their own language, but they're Roman Catholic like just about everybody else in Spain. And the priest said to his parishioners, if we wait, because they were all unemployed, if we wait for jobs, for some capitalist employer to come here and give us a job, we will all die of old age before that happens. So I've got an idea. Why don't we employ ourselves? Why don't we start a co-op? 6 workers and Father Arizmendi started a co-op. 1956. Fast forward to right now, 2015. Now it's called the Mondragon Cooperative Corporation. You can look it up on the internet, read all about it. It now employs, ready, 100,000 people. It's the 7th largest corporation in Spain. It's a family of 250 linked corporations that work with each other, all co-ops. I'm going to give you just a few of the examples of what they do. In their co-ops, it's the workers who hire the managers. I'm going to say that again. The workers hire the managers. And if the workers don't like the managers, they fire them. You live in a world where you think it has to be the other way. There's a rule that they adopted. No one who works in those 250 co-ops that form that corporation, no one can earn more than 8.5 times what anybody else does. The range of difference in this country is 300 to 1. There it's 8 to 1. Guess what? They actually are a society in which everybody is, you ready? In the middle. It's a middle class economy. You know, not like ours with a few rich, everybody's in the middle. They actually have what Americans pretend they have. And they have it because they radically altered how they organize enterprises. Think about it for a minute. There's a model, there's an alternative. And think about fighting the fight for ecological sustainability. What chances we would have if that were the way decisions were made. If we could go into the corporations of America, talk to the mass of people about what saving the environment means for them every day, knowing that they make the decision, not people driven by the profit motive. The unemployment rate in Spain is about 27%. The unemployment rate in the Basque territory is 11%. You know why? Because the co-ops put a primary focus on jobs. They will sacrifice profits to keep people working and in jobs because they're motivated by something other than profit. I tell you the story only because I want you to see this is not some hypothetical model pie in the sky future. This is about a reality. In the final point, in the many years that the Mondragon went from a little co-op of 6 to a huge corporation of 100,000, they had to compete with countless capitalist companies to grow. They did. They won those competitions. It turns out if workers run their own business, they work harder and better than they often do as employees, and they're more efficient, and that's why they won those competitions, and that's why they became larger. They figured out how to go from small to large. Oh, and along the way they did some remarkable things. They set up their own university. It's called the Mondragon University. It has 4 campuses. And they offer an immense array of courses in how to start a co-op, run a co-op, finance a co-op. And they love foreigners to come and learn because they have a kind of missionary zeal about what they do. Final point. They maintain research labs to develop cutting-edge new technologies, ecologically sensitive technologies, new products. And so good are they that 2 American corporations over the last bunch of years have at various times asked and paid Mondragon to put their scientists at work again next to their scientists over there in their labs. I thought you might like to know the names of the 2 American corporations that did that. General Motors and Microsoft. They take advantage of the co-op, and most Americans don't even know what it is. Think about it. We do not have to live in a system as dysfunctional as this. We do not have to shut up about it. We do not have to fear to talk about it. An honest population concerned with itself would long ago have stopped the childish fakery that goes into not discussing the strengths and weaknesses of capitalism and comparing them to the strengths and weaknesses of alternatives, and then letting the people decide what they want. It would take 5 minutes to design the legislation that would allow Americans to see co-ops all over the place and decide for themselves. The interesting thing is not that we don't have it. The interesting thing is that we don't have a discussion about it because we're still stuck in a taboo that's dysfunctional, as is the economy. Thank you very much for your attention.